Welcome everyone to this first webinar we do focused on the Middle East. We've been doing those webinars in the past with context focusing on Europe, but we said, Middle East, such an important region, high growth, lots of things happening there. Let's do something specifically on that region. So this is the first time we do it. A few words on the GTDC. So I think many of you are familiar with us. Well, you know what we do. And one of the important things for us is our meetings, our summits. We just had one in Europe, in Madrid. And we're now working on the next one again in Asia Pacific. So if you want to meet or join those summits, feel free to register. They're for free. We have typically a lot of the vendor community, all of the distributor community, always very good meetings, I believe. So we have APJ coming up in November, EMEA again next year in April, and the US in February. So still a long way out, but yeah, if you can make it, please register. The other thing we do is we do studies. One of them, which is an important one, I just want to highlight to you now. And again, you can find all those studies on our website. So if you scan the barcode there, you'll get to the website. You can also go to the website gtdc.org. You'll find a lot of studies. This one we just released. It's Tech Distribution 2030. It's our view basically of what the distribution will look like in 2030. We've done this also in 25, 5 years ago. So this is an updated version, and very interesting material to read through and to use in your discussion with your teams. So feel free to download and use it. And again, there's many other studies there which you may find interesting. With that, I'll stop talking, and I want to introduce Erik Windell. Erik is going to present the Middle East picture. Well, Middle East and a few global pictures as well. So, Erik, take it away. And
thank you so much, Peter. Hi, everyone. So as Peter mentioned, I'm one of the senior consultants at GfK Middle East Africa. I'm based out of Dubai and have spent 8 years in market research up until this point. And the past 4 years have been specializing in looking after the IT and office industry throughout the UAE, Saudi Arabia, the Middle Eastern markets, as well as some of the African markets. And I'm really, really excited to be here today to uncover some of the insights that the IT and office ecosystem has to offer and help shape this connected world in the Middle East. So the agenda for today is to really understand how the Middle East shapes up against some of the global counterparts in terms of some of the developed regions, some of the developing regions as well. And we'll be considering things like the GDP growth as well as some consumer sentiment. So some of our most recent consumer life studies, we will have some insights from that. And then also uncovering what the tech and durables market looks like in the UAE, and the Middle East, and also how that compares to the global trends. So you'll notice a few similarities and a few differences. So hopefully that'll be something new. And then we'll deep dive the IT ecosystem a bit more. So we'll be focusing on a few categories within the IT and office space to understand if there are any key product categories to be focusing on, and also some key configurations in those key product categories. We'll then wrap up the session at the end, having a look at the smart home technology and the adoption rate of that in the Middle East, which will potentially allow for opportunities later down the line to ensure long-term success. So one of the key things to always consider is the absolute size of the tech and durable market. And I think in 2024, we've had significant changes and challenges in the tech and durables market, with a lot of supply issues coming all the way back from the COVID times. But one thing that stands out is the performance from the Meta 6 market. And what we mean by Meta 6 is really a combination of UAE, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, South Africa, and Morocco. So that consists of the Meta 6 markets. And what we're seeing there is a strong performance of around 6% compared to 2023. And I think one of the further considerations to take into account here is the GDP forecasts. And I think for the longest time, GDP has been one of the measures to really understand where the market is heading. And 2025 is shaping up to be one of those years where it's really difficult to pinpoint what that forecast looks like. Some of the developed markets have been revised in terms of what that GDP forecast looks like, and a lot of that has been informed by the uncertainty as a result of US-driven policy changes, trade tensions, and global conflict. But one thing that remains true is that the Middle Eastern markets and Central Asia is really going to continue to outperform in 2025. Additionally, we can't really talk about global economics without mentioning tariffs. It has been the word on everybody's lips in the first quarter of 2025, and how that shapes up in terms of what the tech and durable market will look like is quite an interesting one. But one thing that is true is that the opportunity that tariffs bring is one that allows us to potentially investigate alternative avenues for export. And I think that is potentially something to consider going forward. Tariffs obviously also will impact the cost of goods, so this will exaggerate the intentional spending of consumers. And the Middle East is one of those regions where consumers are already quite cautious about their spending. We will see a bit later on how a third of Middle Eastern consumers are a bit more cautious when it comes to spending, but they're also very intentional with their spending. And we're seeing that although the consumers in the Middle East are a bit financially more secure than a year ago, that cautious spending continues to carry through. Finally, just on some interesting points when we talk about the IT ecosystem. So this is, again, a culmination of a few product categories. So we're considering laptops, tablets, monitors, and some peripheral devices as part of that IT ecosystem. And when we looked at the ratio of laptops to tablets, we're seeing that there's more tablets being purchased in the Middle East than there are laptops. And I think that is a key indicator that consumers in the Middle East are demanding or have this desire to be connected at all times, and something that a smartphone can no longer do. And then obviously when we wrap up with the smart devices, we'll link that back to the media tablet space. So when we look at the total tech and durable market, or how we call it TCG in this instance, we see that the total turnover for the global tech and durable market is around $760 billion. The growth rate is modest at 1.1%, and a lot of that performance is thanks to what we're seeing out of emerging Asia. Strong 4.9% growth, contributing significantly to that overall figure. But one thing that stands out is that Meta 6 number outperforming emerging Asia, 6% in the Meta 6 region. So the countries contributing to that Meta 6 number, a reminder, South Africa, Turkey, Morocco, Saudi, and the UAE, all contributing to that positive 6% growth, and really getting the Meta region on par with what we're seeing out of Latin America at $53.8 billion. And then we obviously have to consider what's happening in the global economy. And I think, as we mentioned earlier, it's really difficult to pinpoint what the GDP forecast should look like in 2025. The US-driven policy changes and trade tensions as a result of the tariffs have really left a lot up for question. And a lot of the developed markets are, in a bit of limbo at this point. As it stands, we're still unsure as to the tariffs that's being implemented on China, and that will naturally have a significant impact on tech and durables going into the future. But one thing that stands clear, stands head above the developed markets, is Middle East, Africa, and Central Asia. That amidst the conflict in the Middle Eastern region, there's still expectation that the growth will continue in 2025. And I think this really highlights the resilience that we have in the Middle East, We know how to navigate difficult times, and again, the future looks bright in the Middle East. All right, and then when we unpack the Meta 6 figures, so if we on the left-hand side compare trended period since 2019 all the way to 2027, GDP like-for-like comparison highlights that for the foreseeable future, so 2025 to 2027, the forecast for Middle East Africa is ahead of the global benchmarks. So like Peter mentioned earlier, there's a lot of growth in this region, and when we break out it by country, we see that acceleration coming through quite clearly. The UAE accelerating, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, all accelerating. South Africa, after a really slow 2023, seeing some recovery. I think this stands on its own two feet to explain and highlight the growth opportunities that we're seeing in this region. But when we look at the impacts from tariffs, we've just closed out the first 100 days with President Trump in his second run, and tariffs have been the one thing that's been spoken about since December. And I think we all saw the markets go into absolute frenzy. And I believe there's two ways to look at the tariffs. Point one is, looking at tariffs in the US and what that means for the US consumer and for the manufacturers. And point two, what it means for the distributors and suppliers outside of the US. So let's start off with point one. I think point one, naturally, the tariffs will increase the price of imports into the US, which will naturally increase the inflation rate. And I think the US consumer is already feeling that with their standard cost of living increasing, but then we will see what the impacts of tariffs will be later down the line. We keep talking about a 90-day delay on those tariffs being implemented. So I think we expect to see some changes around September this year. This will naturally then also give rise to more intentional spending. I think the consumers will be a bit more conscious about what they're spending their hard-earned incomes on. And I mean, at the start of this year, when the tariffs were first announced, we saw the likes of Amazon adding the tariff amount to your checkout basket. So you could see exactly how much is going towards that tariff. And I think those are some really interesting considerations, at least for the US consumer. Now, what does it mean outside of the US? One thing to consider is that if the cost of importing into the US is increasing, it gives us an opportunity to consider other alternatives in terms of exports. So, for example, potentially exporting into Europe as opposed to exporting into the States. And I think that potentially creates a bit of a risk for stock overflow. So really, it's a catch-22 between number one, finding those alternative trading routes, but number two, also managing the logistics and supply chain that come with that. The foreign exchange will obviously have a natural impact as well. So this is another consideration for distributors to keep in mind. And I think the overall consideration for intentional spending will be a global phenomenon. And when we look at the UAE, this is not something unheard of for the UAE consumers or for the Middle Eastern consumers. We see that in 2023, the consideration or the contribution from the cautious spending was around 30%. And in 2024, that has increased by 3 percentage points. So we now have officially a third of consumers cautious about their spending, even though they are in a better financial position. And I think this is something that we all need to be aware of. I think in 2023 and 2024, the conversation was, yes, there's the possibility of a recession. At the start of this year, there was a talk about recessions as well. But the top concerns going forward for the Middle East is a rise in food prices, potential economic downturn, and then the global conflicts that are very close to home in the Middle East. Okay, and then when we look at the Middle Eastern consumer, it is a consumer that is quite resilient, but also quite pragmatic in its approach. So when we look at the latest outcomes from the consumer life studies in the Middle East, we notice that 57% of those consumers are avoiding waste. So they will be focusing their spend on those items that they will be using. There's not going to be any waste of money for the foreseeable future. And furthermore, I think this is quite apparent as well, is that there's much more planning that goes into those shopping trips. We'll talk about this a bit later, but I think one thing is quite clear in the Middle East, that in order to build those long-term success with your consumer, you need to be at the initial phases of that shopper journey. And considering this planning ahead of that shopper journey, it really does go hand in hand. Now, while we're saying, the Middle Eastern consumer is a bit more cautious and a bit more conscious about their spending, it almost contradicts itself when we start talking about some of the spending intentions for the next 12 months. There's a 30% net change in spending, a positive 30% for out-of-home entertainment. So we're going to be seeing a bit more out-of-home entertainment for the Middle Eastern consumer. There's going to be a lot more socializing and a lot more travel as well. 22.4% increase in spending for international trips. So a lot more to do with buying into the experiences. But then most importantly for today's conversation is the 6.1% increase in spending intention on electronics and technology for the next 12 months. And I think this is going to be quite an interesting consideration going forward for when we start looking at some of the data points. So when we look at the pestle approach for Middle East, we see from a political standpoint, the biggest consideration there is the relationships that the Middle Eastern countries have with BRICS nations as well as the Western superpowers. As we speak, President Donald Trump has just arrived in Abu Dhabi after his long stint throughout Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And this is, again, just highlighting the relationships between the Middle East and the Western powers being such a key consideration. Another really interesting development, and I think this is well overdue, is that we're seeing a shift in terms of an increase in the number of female representation in Parliament. So we're up 2.7 percentage points in 2024. So big shift happening in terms of inclusion and representation. From an economic standpoint, there's a big shift towards a digital economy, as well as pushing the hospitality industry. About 2 years ago, Dubai had achieved its highest tourism number in its history. And I think it just speaks to this tourism industry that continues to buzz in the Middle East. There's continuous development coming out of Saudi, and I think there's lots more opportunity for tourism in this region. From a social perspective, I think one of the key considerations here is just how young the demographic is. There's a lot of under 30-year-olds moving to the region with the desire to build a career and build a life in the Middle East. But with that, there's a lot of pressure in terms of unemployment and also opportunities. And we see that coming through in terms of rental prices for accommodation, but also the job market being extremely tough. And then one of the other considerations from a social perspective is the development of higher education institutions, but at the same time driving that digital economy within that higher education system. I think one of the key things that stand out here is that all of these points really point the Middle East in the direction of a sustainable future, and one that will continue long into the future. And I think one of the key facets of this is that technology is right at the center of it all. Now, the next few slides will really go about unpacking the tech and durable market, highlighting some key sectors that contribute to the tech and durable space. And I really like for you to keep an eye out on the tech, the IT and telecom space, and see how that compares between global and developing regions. So this slide here is a breakdown of tech and durables, like we mentioned. On the left-hand side, we've got a stack bar for 2024. So this gives you the full year of 2024, as well as a Q1 of 2025 to give you an up-to-date view. And the contribution is coming through from consumer electronics, so CE is your PTV, your IT sector, major domestic appliances, your office machines, small domestic appliances, and telecoms. And in dark purple, we can immediately see that contribution from telecoms sitting at 46%, up 2 percentage points from the previous year. And when comparing that to the Meta market, we see pretty decent alignment between the two regions, well, at least from Meta to global benchmark, while the IT space is slightly under-indexed as a result of this bigger contribution from major domestic appliances. Now, key consideration here that the major domestic appliances include any home aircon. And as we're entering the summertime now, I can see those home aircons becoming more and more important. And we do see that really contributing to that overall Meta contribution. The standout here is that overall, for the Meta contribution within tech and durables, that we are aligned with what's happening on a global level. So we are no longer the small blip on the map. We are now a mature market on par with what's happening in the global space. And the next slide really talks to the performance on a quarterly basis. So when we compare Meta in this red line with the global benchmark from Q3 2022 all the way to Q2 of 2024, we see a significant differential between the performance coming through out of Meta to the global benchmark. And also when we compare the 2024 number for Meta, we're seeing significant performance that's ahead of global benchmark for home appliances as well as the IT and telecom sectors. And I think this immediately should be sparking your attention as to how this Middle Eastern region is and continues to be that oasis for growth. And when we break out the tech space, so when we break out the overall tech and durables market across the Meta region, we see that Meta is at 4.9%, but that contribution, the growth rates is coming through quite positively across South Africa, Saudi, UAE, Morocco, and Turkey. But more so, the growth rates from the telecom as well as IT space really driving the performance throughout Meta 6. So the following slide will really help us decode the IT ecosystem and really identify the fundamentals that shape the IT ecosystem. So before we get into the detail here, just a reminder, so when we talk about the IT ecosystem, we're talking about laptops, which is mobile computing, media tablets, monitors, storage devices, peripherals, and then also your networking your network routers. And this is the standard approach we usually follow when we talk about the IT ecosystem, with laptops being the core IT product at the center of it all. Now, comparing Meta to global, we see that global has a significant value generation of around $88 billion, but relatively flat in terms of its performance. As opposed to the Meta 6 growth figure of 5.2%, that's just a cool $240 million being added to the overall market over a space of a year. And I think it's quite clear that mobile computing or laptops contribute the majority of the IT ecosystem, and that's expected. But what is not expected is that in 2023, the media tablet market had a significant shift in the Middle East. So we're seeing a jump from 22% to 24% in terms of the overall contribution. And I think this is the catalyst for what we're about to see over the next few slides. We're also seeing that growth continuing to 28% in the first quarter of this year. So immediately highlighting that, number one, media tablets is here to stay. Consumers are really in demand for this constantly connected life. And a media tablet gives you access to communication while also giving you access to your media. So the next slide is really a nice depiction of what the IT ecosystem looks like. So at the center, we have your laptop for both global as well as the Meta base. And then we have this 0.9x, or like the attachment ratio, really trying to understand how many units of a peripheral device are we selling for each one unit of laptop. And I think this is such a nice way of considering the ecosystem, because it really gives us a view of, how is everything else growing around the laptop space. Now, at a global level, we're seeing that laptops is declining or contracting around 1.2%. But for each laptop sold globally, we're seeing 0.9x of a media tablet. So we're seeing almost a like-for-like comparison or like-for-like ratio between the laptops and tablet market. Now, swap our view over to Meta 6, and we see a different story. We're seeing 30% more volumes of tablets being sold in the Meta 6 region, which is in line with what we just saw on the previous slide. The growth rate is also closer to 20% compared to the global benchmark of 7.2. So media tablets is really where it's at. And I think it really does speak volumes in terms of just, again, establishing that the Middle East is so significant and so dynamic compared to what we're seeing in other spaces of the world. Some other key categories to just consider as well is the likes of monitors. So over the past 18 months, monitors have exploded into the Middle East. It's been phenomenal in terms of the growth rates. And as we'll see later on, everything is around bigger and brighter screens. So that has really been the key driver for the monitor space. And from a peripheral perspective, we're seeing big growth coming through there as well. 17% growth for pointing and 7% growth for the keying space. So again, big focus towards equipping the overall IT ecosystem there. And then if we break out the IT ecosystem by country again, we see one clear trend. Every single country in Meta 6 is outperforming the global benchmark. UAE up 5.2%, Turkey almost 4%, Saudi 5.6%, Egypt a whopping 27.7%. And the contribution in media tablets is coming through from Turkey. That 33.4% coming through from a market contributing 42% of the entire Meta 6 figure, really driving the performance for the media tablets. But let's not forget about the contributions coming through from UAE, South Africa, Saudi, Morocco, all big contributions to the overall media tablet spend. And I think this, again, just highlights that Meta 6 is a media tablet market, and there's so much opportunity to drive this. Now, whenever I see this coming through in the data, my first question is, hey, but is it a new product that's maybe driving the growth rates that we're seeing for the category? Well, so the next slide, this is nice and colorful and cheerful, is going to help us answer that question. So what we're trying to answer here is, how long do consumers hold onto their devices before trading up to the latest tech? Now, each bar here represents the year that the product was launched in. So for example, the dark purple would reflect 2022, will reflect 2020, and then the bright orange would reflect 2025. So again, just highlighting when those products were launched. In the top half of the slide, we have the view of the core IT products, so laptops, monitors, and tablets, comparing Meta 6 to the global market. And in the bottom half, we can consider those to be the peripheral items. Now, one of the key considerations here is when we look at the likes of laptops and monitors, it seems that there is more or less alignment between Meta 6 as well as the global benchmark. And we know this by considering these orange bars in year-to-date March. So in Q1, we can compare the orange bars as well as the blue bars to really understand, like year on year, are we seeing a bigger contribution or a smaller contribution? And with products, you'd expect a smaller contribution as those new devices come into the market. Within the peripheral space, so your mice and keyboards, routers, as well as storage, we do see a much longer trend for those devices launched in 2020, carrying all the way through up until Q1 of 2025. So again, highlighting that, if we want to get into the shopper journey with a consumer, on a peripheral aspect, we will be locking them in for a period of 4 to 5 years in terms of peripherals. So really a big consideration to take into account there. Now, I've left media tablets for last because I think this is where things are quite interesting. Now, if we consider media tablets as a whole, all right, we are seeing that the contribution from the brand new SKUs or brand new products usually holds around for 2 years before people cycle through and get into a new upgrade. This is quite clear when we start looking at the last two data points in media tablets at a global level. Compare that to what we're seeing in Meta, and we're seeing the contribution from the 3-year-old products still relatively large all the way into Q1 of 2025. This immediately tells me that the consumer, the media tablet consumer in the Middle East, is holding onto that device for 1 year longer, meaning that if we join the shopper journey at the outset, we would have locked that consumer in for 3 whole years before they will be looking to upgrade. So it gives us 3 years to really understand, what that next step would be for the consumer. So the question then comes up: what are the products that we will be, what are the products that we're trying to ship into the market? As a distributor, as a supplier, you want to minimize wastage. You want to be only shipping the products that people want to buy. And one of the key considerations here is understanding the key configurations by product group. So again, we're focusing on the key IT categories: laptops, tablets, monitors, and the peripherals. And what we've built is a key, I guess, a primary configuration. So processor and laptops, RAM, storage. And then what we've done is built a comparison between global and the developed markets. All right. And I think what is quite clear before we get into the data is that overall, between these key categories, Meta 6 is aligned with what we're seeing from a global perspective, but also with the developed market. So as we mentioned earlier, the Middle East is no longer a blip that can be missed or can be ignored. We are here to stay, and the contribution that we're making is significant. But at the same time, we also need to be conscious of the type of consumer we have in the Middle East. We spoke about the fact that consumers in the Middle East are cautious. They are intentional about their spending. So finding that balance between the right configuration and the right communication is going to lead to long-term success. All right, so let's get into this and how we read the data. So point one, let's use 14.4 as an example here. So what does 14.4 means is that when we're looking at i5, so an i5 processor with 16 gigs of RAM and 512 gigs of storage, that contributes 14.4% to the entire global laptop market. That one specific configuration contributes 14.4%. And then when we look at i7, for example, that's a 9.8% contribution, and i9, that's 1.7 contribution. And now what's really interesting here is 2 points. Point number one, i5 is the mainstream. It's the mainstream globally. It's the mainstream in Meta 6. We are aligned with what's happening globally. Point number two, i9 is here. It's doing well, and it's alive, and it's keeping going. Once again, aligned with what we're seeing globally. And I mentioned this briefly earlier. Media tablets and monitors, bigger is better. We want bigger displays, we want brighter displays, and we want more storage capacity. Quite clear here. We're seeing display sizes of more than 10 inches in terms of the tablets and a larger storage capacity. So we want to be able to see our, watch our videos, consume our media, communicate with our friends, our families. That's what the media tablets are for now. We're seeing monitors, higher refresh rates. We're seeing the gamers in the Middle East go crazy for higher refresh rates to play their video games, to edit their videos from a content creation perspective. So much focus being applied on bigger and being better as well. So big consideration here. And like I said, it's important that we don't just apply a global approach to the Middle East. Yes, we know that the Middle East has the alignment with global in terms of the trends, but we also have a very different consumer base. So one of the key things that came out of the analysis is we talk about the supplier distributor conversation, or supply and demand. Now, this slide, looking at market intelligence, this is the supply side, right? We're trying to understand, what does the supply look like in the Middle East or in Meta 6? So across the product categories, we're seeing 14 established brands in mobile computing. So in laptops, there's 14 brands that are around to play. In monitors, we've got 55 brands playing in monitors. That's up 11%, 11 brands from the previous year, 7% increase in terms of the number of SKUs. Media tablets is becoming more concentrated, but the peripheral side is growing significantly, 210 brands and gaining by 3 more brands. I think, I'm at a loss for words with the contribution coming through from the peripheral side. There's so much investment there. So the supply is there from the demand, from the consumer data that we've seen. The demand is there, so there's plenty of supply and demand to go around. Another key consideration, and this is something I'm a big dork when it comes to watching MKBHD and him doing his cool tech reviews on YouTube. And we always talk about the ecosystem being generated by a brand. If we look at the A brands in Meta 6, almost all of them can generate or can house a consumer within one ecosystem under one umbrella brand. And I think this is so interesting. If we look at brand A and brand B, they can literally lock you in across every single product category. And this speaks volumes to, number one, if you're brand new into the market, offering that same view in terms of joining the shopper journey and locking that consumer in for long-term success. And I think that's been one of the really cool insights that we were able to capture out of this. Now, the next point in today's session, and before we get to the final bits and pieces, is really talking about smart home in the Middle East. Now, smart home we've just captured as these dark blue bars, and what we're trying to identify here is year-on-year comparisons. How big is smart home to the sectors? Now, one thing that is quite clear is that if the technology for smart home is available, the Middle Eastern consumer will buy into it. It is quite clear in office machines and in small appliances that if the technology is available, consumers will buy in. This is all related to app control or voice control in those small appliances, and we've seen the attachment of media tablets to the IT ecosystem and that whole notion of connectivity through mobility. And I think if we can somehow join the connectivity and mobility of a media tablet to the smart home that we're trying to build in the Middle East through these additional sectors, we're setting ourselves up for long-term success. And then finally, before we wrap up the session, if we look at the overall network of smart homes. So globally, we're seeing a 7.9% gain year on year for smart home devices. And a lot of that growth is coming through from the home appliances, consumer electronics, your TVs. Almost every TV we know now is a smart functionality. Your home appliances come through, tell you've run out of milk, and switching on your AC when you walk into your home. That becomes so ingrained in our lives. And in Meta 6, we're seeing a very similar story. The home appliances are shifting in the same direction as what we're seeing from a global perspective. So once again, establishing that, should there be the availability of the technology, the Meta 6 consumer will be buying into it, will be invested to, improve their daily lives. And once again, it's understanding, how we can integrate the media tablet and laptop space into building a smart home. So with that, we move on to some key points. I think we've identified quite clearly that IT and telecom are the two sectors that's really driving the overall market in Meta 6. And I think one of the key considerations is that of media tablets and that becoming the core device for driving a smart home. One of the key things that I think really stood out for me was just the contribution or the attachment between a tablet and a laptop. There's been so many conversations, particularly within the computing space, as to, are laptops, eventually going to be replacing the laptops? And I think that's going to be really, really interesting to see how that develops over the next few years. The one thing that we are calling out here is the opportunity for suppliers and distributors alike to really navigate this interesting space of smart home and a connected life. And the best way we could do that is by building trust in the early stages of the shopper journey. In the life cycle slides, we had a look at how consumers hold onto their devices in the Middle East. A bigger shift coming through in media tablets in the Middle East as opposed to the global benchmarks. Lock in your consumer early on, and you have them with you for a period of a couple of years. We need to build a customer-centric ecosystem as well. We've seen that the overall IT ecosystem can be centered around one specific core IT product. So how do we connect everything else and build a fully integrated network to focus around improving the consumer's connected life? And then finally, continuously maintain that engagement with the consumer and the latest product offerings to maintain that long-term integration. Once again, we're seeing that consumers are willing to move. We have a growing and a young demographic in the Middle East, and they're constantly on the lookout for what's next in tech. And the drive from local governments as well to drive a digital economy is really going to be aiding that long-term integration. So with that, I thank you for attending. I will hand over to Peter for some closing remarks.
Okay, thank you, Erik. A lot of interesting information.